Good evening, everybody. How's everybody doing tonight? I would like to apologize about the last show I did. I was looking over the top of my glasses at everyone, and that is basically because to be able to see clearly, I have to look over the top of my glasses. So please do not take it as an insult. I'm not trying to put anybody down or anything by doing that, okay? Just wanted to make that clear to everybody, okay? Also, if I look off to the side of the screen, I'm probably looking at my notes or the chat. So please don't take that as a slight of any kind, okay? All right, tonight I'd like to talk about why study psychology and what is psychology, so that people can get an idea of why I was teaching this class in the first place. Most of the lecture notes that I've taken came from, again, The Introduction of Psychology by Dennis Kuhn, and we will be going by that book. That's most of what we'll be doing. I also will add real life examples as I know of them and as I've experienced them. So that might be very lucky for people or very unfortunate for people, depending on your viewpoint. So hopefully it will help you to see the real life applications of what I'm talking about. Okay, I hope my sound is coming through for people. Good, sounds like it is. Okay, why do you want to study psychology? Why indeed? I love this meme. This is how a lot of people start. Oh, I'm raring to go. I want to learn all about psychology so I can understand people better. And then afterwards, you understand people better. And you don't always feel that great about it. So, yeah. Sorry about that. You will, if you're taking any kind of notes, if you're intending someday to take a psychology class and you're thinking, this is going to get me ahead, here's the first thing about people you need to know. People are weird. They do weird things. Some of them can be rationalized. Some of them can be studied. Some of them we have no explanation for, and we grab at straws to try to explain things. But people are just weird, okay? Why study psychology? And that was the question that a lot of my students had asked me. You know, why am I forced to take this course? I'm doing this or I'm doing that. Well, you know, there are many good reasons for that, and many jobs require psychology. We're going to talk about some of those in a little bit. But, you know, it's always good to know a little bit about what other people are talking about, or if you see something in the press, you're reading an article and you go, okay, and I'm going to help you to probably be a better consumer of those kinds of things. You know, when you read something or you see something on the internet and you think to yourself, okay, is this true? Is this right? What's going on here? I'm going to help you to look at those things with a scientific eye. Also, it's nice to know a little bit more about yourself. Please don't try to psychoanalyze yourself as this course goes along, because that's another thing that students fall into, is they will start to look at themselves and go, oh my God, I've got Korsakoff syndrome. No, you probably don't, okay? Or they'll look at their family and go, ah, he's a paranoid delusional. Probably not, okay? But we'll talk about those things as time goes on. Just please don't apply this to everybody you know and think, ooh, I figured out something about them. Okay, I want to talk about some jobs where people might need to know a little bit about psychology. Of course, counselors, yes. Uh, Social workers, it helps. Advertising people. Yeah, we'll discuss some advertising psychology here in this show too. Um, People who want to do research into something, even as something as simple as a blind taste test between Coke and Pepsi, has psychology behind it. Education. A lot of education will involve testing or interpreting testing, or you'll be given some test results on a student and you'll be going, how do I read this? We'll talk about that. Psychology is used in law, not only in law enforcement, drop it or I'll shoot, also in jury selection, FBI profilers, and sometimes if you're in a jury and a psychologist is on the stand and saying, oh, we tested this particular individual and this is what we came up with, you might be able to know a little bit better about how to make a judgment, guilty or not guilty. Also in medical work, a lot of the students I had were student nurses, and they were wondering, why am I in psychology? Please, it doesn't help to understand people and to know how to talk to people in nursing. I think it does. There are a lot of doctors who probably could use a little bit more psychology information. But also, if you go into psychology as a field, there are bunches of specializations. Not one person's going to know everything about psychology. I mean, I don't. I don't even claim to. But here are some of the fields within psychology that, people might need to know about. Of course, clinical psychology, which is what I did. I'll just let you read those. I'm not going to read to you. You don't need me to read to you. But if anybody has a question about any of those, please feel free to bring it up in the chat, and we'll discuss that tonight. Any other questions you might have, bring them up too. Donna is going to make notes about things. Okay? All right, so that gives you some idea about some of the kinds of things that people will do in the field of psychology. It really is a huge, huge field, and there's too much to cover in our little class. We're going to take the fast train through here. Oh, look, there goes Freud. Oh, we almost missed it. So, we won't get into everything, but, like I say, that's why we're letting people ask questions, and we're going to look at those comments later and try to see what we can work out for you. Okay. We're not going to talk a whole lot about the history of psychology, but we will touch a little bit on that in a little bit. One of the things that we have to discuss is, what is psychology? And there are people who will say psychology is the study of behavior. Well, okay. And some people say psychology is the study of the mind. Okay. I think the definition given here, the science of behavior and mental processes, is probably a fairly good one. Although you get neuropsychologists and they're talking about, structures in the brain, and we can't, throw them under the bus. So, yeah, it's kind of hard to even define psychology because of this. And, but we do try to be scientific about things. We look at what we can see. Empiricism is brought up a lot, and that's direct observation and measurement of things. Very important. Data is the king of psychology. And if data is the king, then verification of the data is the queen. We always want to verify our data. Data by itself is great, but it has to be verified. It has to be retested. It has to be gathered by more than one person. It has to be questioned. And we'll go into that in more detail in just a little bit too. Okay. We try to be systematic when we do research in psychology. There are things that are very physical and very meticulous. Brain surgery. Where do you cut in the brain to help this particular person? That's a very meticulous thing. Some things are more nebulous, like ink blot tests or graphology, trying to tell a person's personality by the way they write. Less empirical, perhaps. So we're going to be really careful when we start looking into these things. A lot of studies in psychology have been done on animals, and that's, questionable at times. Mice running down a maze might teach us something about, how to learn how to run a maze. I don't know many humans that need to learn how to run a maze to find a piece of cheese, but, some of those studies might help. But we have to be careful when we're comparing animals and humans, unless you're a comparative psychologist and you're comparing, okay, people do this, chimps do this. Is there a comparison between the two? Is there something we can learn from that? Those kind of comparisons are good. But I always question when something has been tested on animals and then generalized to fit a human model, because it doesn't always work, people. And we have emotions that we have. I think some animals have emotions too, but our emotional makeup will mess up any study that you try to do. So there we go. So the goals of psychology, I want to talk a bit about that. Most of the time when we're studying this, we're going to try to describe what people do, understand what they do, predict what they do, and sometimes even control what they do. And control is the one that brings up everybody's hackles. Well, controlling what somebody does is like if somebody is afraid of being in an elevator, and I work with them to control that fear. That's a control. Now, the advertising psychologist is going to use control in a different manner altogether. We try to keep wrong and right out of it, but sometimes psychology can be used the wrong way too, as far as what most people would be concerned. So keep that in mind. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the history of psychology. Psychology first started a long time ago in the early 1800s, let's say. It was part of philosophy. And mainly these guys were old rich white guys who sat in nice wing-back chairs in a library and said, let's look at our own minds and think about thinking, and maybe we can figure out why people do things by thinking about it. And they called this an introspection. Okay, it helped a little bit to get things started, but it's not really a great way of studying things. Because first of all, they're old white guys, they're rich probably, to be able to sit around all night thinking about things like this. And, that's not going to be applicable to everybody. So it was a good start. Good job, guys. Nice try. Okay. The next portion of psychology started with structuralism. And structuralism tried to make structures in the brain. They tried to think, okay, let's look at consciousness, for example. is there a structure to consciousness? Can we make a model? And models will be important later. Can we make a model of consciousness so that it can be studied? Can we, describe it, understand it, predict it, and control it? So they were getting there, getting closer. The next portion was functionalism. Functionalism looked at the functions of our brain and our functions of our perceptions and the functions of mental processes. How does it apply in the real world? And it was heavily influenced by, Charles Darwin's theories, heavily on environmental issues. This is how they started. Then behaviorism came along in the 1940s, I want to say, and behaviorism was looking at almost behavior to the exclusion of everything else. They thought that everything was a response to the environment, and you learn things in childhood, and then you just repeated that pattern over and over and over again. And they weren't really looking at any higher mental functions, and they kind of anyway. Gestalt was another model of psychology that came up, and Gestalt was like, you can't take experience apart like that. You can't take little bits for study. You have to look at the whole of the person. It was a holistic philosophy before holistics were still even around and seen as holism. So, they were closer to the mark. Freud came along. He had what we call a psychodynamic view. He thought everything was due to unconscious motives that were, deep in the psyche. And he was trying to build a model as well with little bits and pieces. Ego, superego, id. If we talk about those later, I'll explain them in greater detail. A lot of his stuff is looked down on today because it was a product of its time. Later, humanistic psychology came up, and humanistic psychology was much more interested in the potential of people, problem solving, things that you do every day, and that kind of took over a lot of what modern psychology is. Most folks are very eclectic today. You'll hear that term, eclectic. Eclecticism is basically taking little bits from everybody. So, if we're helping a person who has a fear of elevators, like I mentioned before, we might take a very behaviorist approach. If we're helping someone to get along with people better, we'll take a more humanistic approach. And there are therapies within there we'll talk about too. So, basically, that's where that comes from. A question that comes up a lot to me is, okay, what's the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist? Okay, well, a psychologist is usually somebody who at least has a master's degree, okay, and who studies psychology and, is involved with it somehow. Okay, a psychiatrist is someone who has done that and also has a medical degree, so they can prescribe medications. Now, in some states, if you have a doctorate in psychology and you've taken more medical courses, what we call postgraduate courses, fun stuff, and you take the exam, some psychologists can actually prescribe medication. But most of them don't like to do that. If they want to do that, they just become a psychiatrist instead. Okay, what is a counselor? What's it? You might hear counselor, advisor brought out. That could be a person with a bachelor's degree or a master's degree who has, well, at least in our state, has gone before the board and taken an exam and they have their license. Or they work for an agency like I did, who says, This person meets all the standards. They are licensed. Ta-da. So if a person's calling themselves a counselor, that might be where they got that. Now, advisor, well, yeah, that goes in with life coaches and things like that. Just about anybody can call themselves that, even without a bachelor's in psychology. So, sometimes it's good to, if you're going for counseling, to meet that person, look at their wall. What kind of, diplomas do they have? Did they do it all by mail order? Okay, so, be thinking about those kinds of things. Okay. I want to bring up skeuomorphism. Okay, you don't have to remember this, okay? But skeuomorphism is when you take things that are digital or imaginary and you try to give them some sort of meaning that would have meaning in the real world. And this is why you have a little picture of a diskette as save on your applications. So when you go to Microsoft Word, say, or something like that, and there's a little picture of a diskette there, that is because we used to use diskettes to save things, and that is skeuomorphism. Psychology kind of does the opposite of that, okay? We're going to take things and we're going to try to give them real world, but they're things that happen in the mind. And I liken this to storming a castle, okay? Hey, let's go get those swords now, people. Swords. I know we have some swords people in the audience here. But, we're not going to do much damage to those stones. What's going on inside that castle, or mind in this case? Well, we could ask somebody. They may not tell us the truth because they don't want us to know the secrets of the castle. We could just keep watching it. Maybe we'll learn something that way. Maybe. Or we could get a trebuchet. We could load some rocks in it and throw rocks across the top of it and listen and see if anybody yells and screams. Okay? That's sometimes what we have to do in psychology. We are trying to experiment, and we can't really view exactly what's happening in the person's mind. But we're going to try to make some educated guesses by flinging rocks in there. Not physically, but, Okay? So that's where I kind of use that as my metaphor. And what you're going to do is you're going to build up a medical model or a psychological model based on what you study. Like, you're going to build up a mental model of, I think those rocks hit something else in there. I think it hit stone. It sounded like stone hitting stone. I'll bet there's a castle inside the castle. There's a keep in there. Sounds like it might be about 50 feet from the outer wall. Okay, see, we do the same thing in psychology. We're building that model. And the models that I talked about kind of before, like Freud's ego, id, and superego, those aren't real things, okay? They're not like the diskette, but we're going to put a picture of them in our little psychology book because they give us a model to look at how a person might act. And that's the only reason those are there. Don't think that they have validity in real world. You can't just take out somebody's id and they're going to behave better because it won't work that way. So these are models. I wish somebody had explained that to me when I first started taking psychology, because I thought, all these theories, wow, and they disagree. What's going on? Well, those are the models that people came up with to try to explain things. And none of the models will explain everything. There's always something unexplained and going on. So just know that that's what they're trying to do. Okay, I'm going to see if there's any questions here that people have about. Okay, someone mentioned forensic psychology. Yes, very much so. Okay. Bladed Thesis brought up, he was listening to a podcast today, and some woman called in saying she had 2 doctorates. When the host asked, in what? She said she had no schooling and no professors. Okay. You can get a doctorate if you donate enough money to a college. And they'll give you an honorary doctorate. That doesn't mean you've learned anything. Sorry. Yes. Okay. Good. Yeah, we're going to talk some more about phobias in another episode. So that's good information, folks. Good information. All right, I want to talk a little bit about the scientific method now, because that's something that it catches some people up. At the top, we have an observation we might do. So you watch people in a mall, and there's a fountain in the middle of the mall, and people walk around the fountain. And a lot of people walk around the fountain on the right side of the fountain. At least, from their point of view. And you question that. You say, wow, I wonder why they do that. So you're going to research the topic area. You're going to see, has anybody else ever studied why people walk on the right side of the fountain in a mall? Is there something to this? What's going on? Is it something about the right side? Is it because they're right-handed? So you start to form what we call a hypothesis, or that's an educated guess, Okay, my guess would be, if this were me, I would say, I'll bet that this is because people drive on the right side of the road, and they'll walk on the right side of the road, perhaps. And maybe they see the mall as a road, and they will walk to the right side of that blockage, okay? So we're going to test with experiments, is our next thing. So what do? Well, we get permission from the mall to block off the right side. We put some tape up there or some cones so people can't walk around the right side. And then they start walking around the left. Or they go over the tape or under the tape. And so we're going to analyze that data later and see, did people have such a habit that they still did it, or did they change? And we might ask them as they're going around the left side of the fountain, would you prefer to go around the right side or not? And if they say, yes, it's really disturbing me, okay, then we'll report those conclusions. And we don't report them to the local newspaper. We report them to a psychological journal, okay, because we want this to be known in the community, okay? It's, a pat on the back for us, yay. But also, we want it to be questioned. Other psychologists will write in and say, you didn't give them any choice, Karl. You blocked it off. It's not like you made it, so they could still go to the right with trouble. And, the questions you asked them when they went to the left were rather leading questions. You can't do that way. So it makes you question and make more observations, and continues and continues. This is a problem for a lot of people because they'll say, well, science told me this back in, the 1980s, and now they tell me something different. Well, maybe we've learned something since then. I hope so. Science is always changing, always getting more precise. And if we don't change, then it's not a science. So, it's a dogma at that point. Science is always going to be changing and such. Many of us grew up with the planet Pluto, and that's been taken away. That's been decided by a group of astronomers that no, it's a dwarf planet now. And that was a definition that they changed. So definitions can change as well. Many of the things that I'll talk about later in abnormal psychology used to have different names and used to be in different categories, and now they've changed. And I had to learn some of the new terminology. Oh, anyway. So, yes, science is always changing, and the scientific method will give us some knowledge about that. We have to be aware of our bias, because sometimes in psychology we will have a bias towards something. We think it's because of this, and that's our hypothesis, and we're going to stick with it, and we find out that that's not right, but we say, no, I'm sure it was. I think I tested them wrong. I think I may have tested them wrong. I think my hypothesis is still right. I think they still walk around the fountain because of the way they drive. We'll have to figure this out. And okay, if you want to test it again, that's fine, but you've still got to be able to not have a bias. Now, maybe I'll go to Britain and see if they have a mall and see if people there walk around the left side of their fountain. Okay. So maybe my hypothesis is still correct, but I have to change my bias and look at other people. Okay, so that is scientific method, and we really have to stick with that and make sure that we keep watching on it. Sometimes it's not just the observer bias, but the observer will actually interfere. There was a guy that decided, if we go out on the sea in this raft boat, okay, it was big, it was huge. I think he took 10 people with him, and he was there to watch what happened. But his hypothesis was, after we're out there for like a week or so and things start getting rough, people are going to turn animalistic. They're all, he had male and female participants. He said, they're all going to have sex together. It's going to be like monkeys. They're going to be violent. There's going to be somebody nearly killed. He interfered with the experiment. He actually, when the people really got along, I mean, they were singing Kumbaya at night, and they were respectful of each other. And he's like, well, this isn't what I predicted. He actually interfered, and he would deny people food. He would spread rumors about this person sleeping with that person. That's not a good scientific method. So the observer cannot interfere with the experiment. Sometimes it's the power of being observed which will mess up an experiment. The Hawthorne experiments were done in Hawthorne, New Hampshire, I think, and they wanted to study, will the lighting in the factory change how production is? So we're going to lower the lights a little bit in this factory and see if people produce more. Now, they told the people, you're going to be studied. There's going to be these psychologists walking around. Just ignore them. They're studying productivity or whatever. So they lowered the lights a little bit. And what happened? Production went up. They said, whoa, okay, maybe people don't like those bright lights, And then they turned the lights up higher than they were before. And production went up higher. Oh, okay. Then they turned the lights to the regular level, and production went even higher. It was the fact that they knew they were being studied, and they knew their production was being studied. So they didn't know what was being changed exactly. Maybe they said, well, it's a little dark in here today, but okay. but they didn't realize exactly what was the whole idea of the study. But they knew they were being studied, and so they performed. you know, and so we've learned the Hawthorne effect, and that is you don't always want to tell people exactly what you're studying because they will change to fit whatever their particular bias is. There's another bias called the courtesy bias, and that is where you give people more credit, you know, like, well, I'm sure those people were doing that because they were just trying to be nice. Okay. And there's also gender bias, where if you're studying a particular gender and you have a rather negative hypothesis towards that gender, you may be showing a gender bias. Or you might find out that men and women sometimes act differently in the same situation. Duh. But you got to account for that in your studies. Okay. So yeah, you always got to be aware of those biases that happen in psychology. Now here's an interesting thing I found. This is a study that someone did. They looked at the stock price of Home Depot, and they looked at the prevalence of autism being diagnosed. And they said, hey, as the stock price of Home Depot goes up, so do we find more cases of autism. Well, that's total bunk. And she knows that she did this study to prove a point. And that is that just because two things relate or we call it correlation, you know, they correlate together, does not mean that one causes the other. Okay? So that's something that a lot of people fall into. They'll see these studies and they'll say, ooh, these are correlated. Okay, but that doesn't mean that one causes the other. We could just as much say that being autistic raises the price of Home Depot because maybe as you become more autistic, you like Home Depot better than Lowe's. You know? Or it's probably both caused by something totally different. So, you know, be careful of those sort of things. You'll see a lot of studies that'll say, we found a correlation between these two. Yeah, maybe you did. But you didn't prove any sort of causation there. Sorry. Try again. Okay. Donna has pointed out that at least when she was in school, they were taught to walk on the right side of the hall. And that would be something else we should ask people. You know, okay, in my next study, I'm going to ask people who walk around the right side of there, were you taught in school to walk on the right side of the hall? And then we'll ask the British people, do you walk on the left side of the hall? You know, we'll watch some school kids and we'll see if they do the same kind of thing, you know? So, yeah. I think we're on to something here. Yes, Dan. The people with clipboards always make people just a little bit suspicious, scared, puts them on the spot. Also, it changes behavior. Good or bad, it can change the behavior. And so, you know, you've got to be very careful. Jane Goodall watched the apes that she studied for many years before she started interacting with them. She watched them from afar. And sometimes I feel like I'm doing this all the time. When I go someplace, I try to watch people from afar and see what's going on. Because if you get involved, you're part of the experiment now, and you don't want to do that. Okay. Usually in my class, I go through what's called dependent and independent variables. Basically, what these are the variables of your experiment. So, I'm not going to talk too much about those unless people ask more about them. And if you do make a question down here, we'll look at that later. And we can go into great detail on it, but it's pretty boring. Basically, your dependent variables are things that change. The independent ones are the ones that the experimenter's playing with, and that's really all you really care about. We have to do most of our experiments we'll do with control groups if we can. So if your thing is, okay, I'm going to show people a bunch of words and maybe we'll use them in a sentence and see if they will learn language faster that way, then you're going to have another group that you don't show the pictures to, but you just use words, foreign words in a sentence and see if they learn that way. So that would be your control group. But the experiment is, do showing pictures at the same time that you're explaining these words actually help you in learning. So a control group is very careful, or very useful in that. And you don't want to let people know which group they're in because there's something called a placebo effect. And you've probably heard of sugar pills. Your old aunt went to the doctor and complained about pain or something, and the doctor gave her a pill. And okay, is it real? Is it a placebo? Is it a fake sugar pill? Maybe he thought that her pain was in her mind, and he gave her the pill just to kind of get rid of her. That happens a lot in medicine. And the placebo effect will make you do something because you think you've been treated. So because of that, we do, we do a blind study, where the people don't know what group they're in. Now, the best studies are double blinds, okay? And that is where you set up the experiment, okay, we're going to do this and that. We are going to get some students in to help us, and they're going to be the ones that are asking the questions like, okay, did you walk on the right side of the fountain because you used to walk on the right side of the hall in school? But we don't tell them who is in the control group and who's in the experimental group. This works better with the pictures and language example. We have Susie with the pictures and the sentences. We have Joe over here. He's just teaching by verbal. But we don't tell them which is the control group and which is experimental, because they might influence the experiment by knowing which group they're doing. It happens. And so when you hear the double blind study, that's what it is. Even the person helping with the experiment doesn't know exactly what's being studied, so they can't affect the experiment either. And all experiments need replication, meaning they need to be repeated, or they need to be done by another group somewhere else. Because often you'll find that when people do an experiment, it might work for them, but it won't work for anybody else. And so getting that repeated by somebody else, and I'll tell you, there's a problem with this, and I'll explain more as we go along. But, we really need those repeated by different people. One of the problems is that nobody likes to replicate experiments. And academia, even though they're some of the ones that tell us, well, you have to replicate that experiment, academia doesn't reward replicating the experiments. If you go in and say, well, I'm going to do my doctoral thesis on, learning with pictures and language at the same time, and they say, yeah, McFadden did that way back in 1990. And you say, yeah, I'm going to see if I can replicate those results. Well, no, not for your doctoral thesis. You can't do that. You got to do something new, innovative, something publishable, something sexy. And it's like, okay. So it actively discourages people from replicating experiments, which is, in my opinion, wrong. Wrong-headed. Sorry, that's not scientific. We So, I hope that all of this helps people if they read things in the popular press or if they see something on a YouTube video. Oh, whoops. That they'll be skeptical about it. Be okay. I'll take that with a grain of salt. I'll go see if 3 other YouTube videos say the same thing. Then I'll believe it. And if somebody says, "Well, I am a doctorate, I know," well, okay, that's nice, but I'll see you 3 other doctors. 9 out of 10 dentists recommend this toothpaste. Okay, that's good. If one dentist recommends that toothpaste, I want a second opinion. Okay. You have to consider the source, especially now with all the political machinations that go on. When people say, "Well, this study says this," okay, where is this coming from? Where's the source of this? Sometimes people have been known to play with results. And it's shocking and terrible, I know. But yes, some psychologists are people too. And they will play with the results to either get closer to their hypothesis, or they'll, like the raft guy, they'll get in there and they'll mess up things. Or they'll just, one guy was caught out and out lying. His results showed no change in the experiment. But he couldn't do that. He couldn't publish that. He wouldn't get his doctorate if he did that. So he actually just made up data and lied. The shame of that rippled through the community for years, and we're finally just now getting over that again. But boy, there were a lot of rules put in place to make sure that did not happen again. Was there a control group? There can't always be a control group for everything, but it's good if there was. Look for the errors of causation and correlation. Distinguish between observation and inference. Sometimes people get a little carried away. They observe something. People go to the right of the fountain, and they looked nervous. That's an inference. Okay, that's a guess. You don't have any data for that, so don't fall for those. Also, there's oversimplifications that people will do. They'll oversimplify something, especially if it's going to go in the newspaper. So you'll see something like Home Depot stock causes autism. No. I always taught my students to look at whose name is on the check. Okay? Basically, if somebody funds a study, they're going to want that result to be their way. And if your study doesn't prove their point, they'll fund another study that will prove their point. So, if the people that wrote that check are not to be trusted, then don't trust them. Okay? Like I said, that one success does not make for a good theory, does not make for a good experiment. We really do need to repeat those results. So those are the things that I look for when I'm reading something. I start questioning, hey, where did this come from? What is it saying? Is it making inferences it shouldn't? And the last thing I want to talk about is ethics of experiments. There have been cases where people have been injured or psychologically injured in experiments. And we will be talking about some of those as we go along. Um, there is an ethics committee at every university and think tank group that has to look at your experiment and say, I don't know about this one. I don't think that's an ethical experiment to do. And so that's one of the things to consider. Okay, we've almost got to an hour. I want to see if anybody else had any more comments about this particular topic. Okay, very good, Joe. Menards for life. Yes. Okay, Dan, that would be a good thing that you might want to study. Being hungry when you go grocery shopping causes you to spend more money. I think someone has done that. You might do some research on that and find somebody else has already done it. But you know, I often think, boy, if I had the research grant, I would go study this. And then I find out somebody else already done it, but maybe I could help replicate their results. You know, also at the time of day, Foxy points out, hey, other times of day, you know, people might just want to get home and have dinner, or maybe they've already eaten their lunch, so, you know, they might not spend as much money. Okay, yes. Confirmation bias by the paycheck? Yeah, that happens as well. And as I go on more, this is one of the things that makes me drink. And this is why we call this the Drunken guide, because I will have to drink for that episode, because I will have some things to say. They won't be nice, and I hope that YouTube forgives me. Uh, okay, the experiment that people shocked each other or thought they were shocking each other. Yes, the Milgram experiment. It went down in psychological history as a very unethical experiment. Um, it needed to be done. It couldn't be done today, but it did kind of need to be done. What happened was they would have an experimenter on one side of the glass, and on the other side of the glass was the subject, okay? And they bring in the person being studied, and they say, okay, look, that guy over there, he's going to try to answer some questions. If he's right, good, nothing happens. If he's wrong, push this button and give him a shock. It's a little shock. It won't hurt him. Okay. So they did the experiment. Now, nobody is actually being shocked. These are actors on the other side of the screen. Okay? They were taken from the drama department of the college. Okay? So they get a little shock. Oh, okay. Let's turn it up. And the experimenter would reach over and turn the volume up a little bit on this. You know, let's crank it to 2. But you know, it's still shocking. Okay, so he would get the answer wrong because that's what he's getting paid to do, and so he'd get a shock. He'd jump a little higher this time. Oh, gee, that hurt. Let's turn it up to 3, and they'd crank it up to 3, and eventually, people are grabbing their hearts and going, "Oh my God!" But the people would still shock them the next time, and the thing that they were trying to study is, what will you do when an authority tells you to do something you don't want to do? And sadly, a lot of people will do it. Okay? I think this was kind of wanting to know how could regular German people follow Hitler? Because, they didn't agree with him, but they followed anyway. They allowed things to happen. How did they allow these things to happen? Well, authority told them to. And sadly, we still follow the big monkey. We're not too much better than the chimps in that regard. If big monkey says shock 'em, we shock 'em. And so you couldn't do that today because it didn't harm the people being shocked because they were not shocked. They were faking it. But it did harm the students who thought they were shocking people. Many of them turned up later for counseling. They were having nightmares. They thought they had killed somebody. They thought they were hurting people. They would skulk around campus so that the person that they shocked wouldn't run into them and punch them. There was a lot of psychological damage done by that study. So it could not be done today. But it's a good thing it got done when it did, because it did tell us something about how people will react to authority. Okay, if there are no other questions, we'll dismiss class for tonight. Have a good one, and we'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody.